I'm Paul Daddy from Paul Daddy's Blind Hog Barbecue, and today I'm going to share with you my experience repainting my Yoder YS1500 smoker. My intentions are to repaint the pit only. The cart still looks pretty good, but the pit, however, showing some rust, especially on the lower middle section, on the front and the back. Now the lower part of the pit has a lot of blistered paint, and that's where the smoking chamber meets the cart. Now I'm coming at this from a DIY perspective, so hopefully this may help others who want to tackle this project at home. And of course, sandblasting the smoker and then repainting with a paint gun in a paint booth, that would be ideal. But like I said, this is the DIY approach. Now my Yoder's a little over 2 years old, and it has just enough corrosion that I'm not quite as proud of it as I once was. I live in Texas on the Gulf Coast, and my smoker always has a roof overhead. But a hard blowing rain, you know, the kind that comes in sideways, now that can get it wet. I had originally ordered a cover, but it was on back order. And then when I got home with my YS1500, I just couldn't bear the thought of covering it up, so I canceled the order on that cover. Now the other part of that decision was based on the fact that I'm able to use my smoker 12 months out of the year. There is no off season here. Okay, let's talk about my painting plan. I decided to use Rust-Oleum high heat 2000 degree primer, and I'd put that on any area that got sanded down to bare metal, and then I would finish up the can as far as it would go. And the shipping on that OEM paint was a little bit pricey, so that was a deal breaker to me. So I just looked for an alternative, and I ordered the Stove Bright paint, satin black, from Amazon. And I'll get back to the Stove Bright a little bit later. Now the first thing to do is remove the stainless steel shelf, and then I taped off the cart with painter's tape and a plastic drop cloth that I got from Dollar General. And I decided to leave the stack in place because I've added a gasket to that, and I didn't want to mess that up by taking it off. So you also have to tape up the ID plate and the control display. And that controller knob requires a tiny little flat blade screwdriver to remove it. So my decision on the spring handles was simply to cover the springs with tape, because I had looked at the keepers that hold the springs in place, and I would have had to replace those if I disassembled it, and I didn't want to tackle that at this time. Now one other thing to mention, that the various screws on the smoker, they all have a silver finish, and my decision was to paint them black. So that's a lot easier, and it offers them some corrosion protection that they don't have normally. Now the smoker's going to get sanded down. I'm going to use 80 grit sandpaper followed by 220 grit sandpaper on the corroded areas, and I'll use my cordless sander to do this. And of course the areas where the round smoking chamber meets the cart, that's very difficult to reach, so I went back and sanded those areas by hand. And I'm trying to get the bad spots down to the bare metal. The rest of it gets lightly sanded with the 220 grit paper. Okay, when you get through all your sanding and your prep work, I sprayed down the smoker with a degreaser. I used Star Bright Ultimate Citrus. Wipe it down with the cloth, let it dry. You can use the fan to speed up the drying process, and just don't underestimate how effective this degreaser is, so you can tell that it does a great job. Now I found my old Rust-Oleum comfort grip. Now that's a handle, and it kind of turns your paint can into a spray gun. So I've had this for years, and it works great on Rust-Oleum paint cans. It's simply amazing. You want to shake the primer per instructions on the can. And then I got started painting using the high heat primer. It's actually automotive paint, and it's 2000 degree paint. The comfort grip handle did an amazing job, and this handle makes a big difference, and I didn't have any issues spraying the primer. Now when that primer's dry, it's time for the black satin paint, and this is where all my problems started. So I decided to try that comfort grip on the Stove Bright paint, and unfortunately as soon as I picked it up, the can dropped and it broke part of the spray nozzle. Well, you know, the show must go on. The nozzle was intact, but the fingertip area was greatly reduced, so it was pretty small to start with. After I shook up the paint for the full 2 minutes, I gave it a test spray around back on an old board, and it was kind of disappointing because it gave out a blast of droplets, and then it seemed to work, so I went on to the smoker. It was giving me a limited flow, and then it would blast out the droplets everywhere. I searched through my old paint cans for nozzle replacements. So I had 2 nozzles I wanted to try, but it was kind of the same old story. I felt like I was trying to paint a house with a toothbrush, and just when I got an area painted, then out come the droplets. Now I tried another nozzle that I had from a Yoder touch-up paint can that came with the smoker. Now it was by far superior to the others, and it definitely had a lot more volume. Now the problem was that this nozzle too would start plugging up, and then out come those droplets. So it would trash my paint, and I know that I used an excessive amount of paint because of the bad application process. So eventually I ran out of paint before I was finished. Then I had a thought. I thought maybe the rubber gloves that I was wearing, they stick off the fingertips a bit. I thought, well, maybe that's interfering with my spray pattern. And with all this in mind, I went ahead and ordered more paint. Now my new plan, I ordered 1 more can of the high heat primer and 4 cans of the Stove Bright black satin paint. And I wanted to be sure that I had enough to complete the project, and the leftover paint could always be used later. It took a week for the new paint to get here, and then I used brass brushes on my cordless drill to clean up that blistered area some more and get it down to more bare metal. And after priming again, then it was time for the Stove Bright. And I found that none of these cans performed any better than the first one. So it turns out that my glove interference theory, it just wasn't right. The Stove Bright was terribly difficult to apply. Now, thank goodness I still had that nozzle from the Yoder can, and this nozzle helped me get through the project. Even though it plugs frequently, it was my best option. Now, some side notes. I had one area on the back side of the smoker where the cart has corrosion. So that's the orange paint. And I taped this section off and I painted it black. So that's out of sight, out of mind. I added a thin bead of black RTV sealant between the smoker and the front side of the cart. So I'm trying to protect the leading edge of the paint on the cart. Now that stainless steel shelf has a carbon steel frame, and the T25 Torx was used to remove the screws for disassembly, and the frame was sanded, degreased, primed, and painted. And there was a lot more corrosion on that stainless steel on the underside of the shelf than what I was happy with. So I sprayed those bad areas with the black paint. They're not gonna show when it's reassembled. And then I added some double-sided tape to keep the shelf from touching the frame and reassemble. And that tape does not have to be double-sided, but that's what I had on hand. I don't really know how well it'll work, but I'm giving it a try. Now I restored the plastic on the cart handle by heating up the plastic with a heat gun on very low heat. Now it takes a little bit of time doing it this way, but it brings the oils back up to the surface and they look great. Now you could just go ahead and spray paint them black. That would work too. The metal part of the handle was all repainted black. The temperature gauge probes, they were cleaned using Dawn Power Wash. This is great stuff. After removing the drop cloth and the painter's tape, there's a few areas that had a little bit of overspray. So once again, the Dawn Power Wash saved the day. Just don't get this on your new paint, and if you do, wipe it off immediately. Before I put the smoker back in service, I removed all the grates and the heat diffuser plates. I vacuumed out the inside of the smoker, and then the grates and the heat diffuser plates were rinsed off with cold water. And after they were dried, I oiled them up with cooking spray and reinstalled. I'm hoping that I can make it another 2 years before I have to repaint again. The Yoder looks a lot better than it did, but this project was a lot harder than it had to be because of the paint application. Stove Bright paint cans suck, in my opinion. I had kind of tricked myself into buying more after the bad experience with the first can. You know, I thought the problems came from me dropping the can, damaging the nozzle, and maybe from the rubber gloves. I really think my biggest issue stemmed from the fact that I wanted to maintain that satin black as the color, and this restricted my options, and I wound up with the Stove Bright paint. And really, the Stove Bright paint seems to be okay, but the application makes it very hard to love, so I don't intend to buy any more. Ever. You know, my next paint job may include painting the cart, but by then maybe it'll be time for some new colors. I'll probably consider using Rust-Oleum paint next time. It's generally cheaper, it's easy to get, it has a great application process, and you can use that comfort grip handle. I've never considered myself a Rust-Oleum fanboy, but maybe I am. My Yoder YS1500 is back to looking like a shiny new penny. The general appearance is great. The devil's in the details, and those details could have been just a little bit better. I'm hoping that you can learn from my mistakes, and I'll let you know how this holds up, but 2 years seems to be the benchmark for black paint on a barbecue pit. Now, all you got to do is hit that like button on your way out, consider subscribing, and I hope to see you next time at Paw Daddy's Blind Hog Barbecue.